dive right into grain markets. And here discussing grain markets today with me is Jim Rappoon. Jim is a VP and office manager in Mount Vernon, Iowa, and has been with Hertz for 40 years. Jim, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks, Casey. Good morning, everyone.
So let's start off by having you explain what factors typically determine commodity prices.
Okay, great. Well, we're going to talk today about corn and soybean prices, and the comments that I'll make in terms of price direction really correspond directly to all commodity prices. So essentially, what we're really looking at now is supply and demand. And obviously, we're at a time in the growing season where we have a much better idea in terms of what supply is. But really, as we look over the past 2 years or so, we have had a number of disruptions in terms of overall demand. As we look at the next slide, it'll kind of give you a little bit of an outline in terms of some of the items that we're going to touch on. They vary a little bit depending on how they've affected corn or soybean prices. But one of the first things that we dealt with about 24 months ago, so essentially July of 2018, began the time period when the dispute with China started. And so we really started to clearly see some impact in the market. We had other trade issues that we were dealing with. We pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And we also started the negotiation process in terms of NAFTA. And the good news is that NAFTA has been really improved into the USMCA. We're going to talk about that in a little bit as well. But of course, more short-term, COVID-19 clearly has had a negative impact on the corn market, especially as to how it affects ethanol demand. And so that has clearly been a pretty significant issue. But as I said earlier, overall production has really been quite consistent over the past 3 years. We've had good weather overall. For the most part, I think much of the Midwest, including Nebraska, has some really good areas. We have some perimeter areas that clearly are seeing lower than average yields, but overall we're seeing areas that are kind of offsetting some of the lower producing areas because we're seeing some almost near record yields in some areas of the Midwest. And so that kind of gives us a little bit of background in terms of what we're going to talk about in terms of the grain markets. As we move on to corn, I think one of the first things that we had mentioned earlier was the USMCA, the United States, Mexico, and Canada agreement. Took a little while for that to get negotiated. It was approved by Congress and then by both Canada and Mexico, but it really clearly did improve overall corn prices, primarily because Mexico and Canada represent about 25% of our total export market, so they are definitely key players in terms of overall trade. And you can see that especially in 2019, we had some very high corn prices supported by some good overall demand. As we move forward then beyond some of these trade agreements that affect corn prices, one of the biggest impacts that we've had, in terms of overall corn prices has been the effect of COVID, especially on ethanol production. And so one of the biggest negatives I think that we've experienced is that EPA has granted some waivers to small refineries. And this has overall reduced ethanol consumption since 2016 by about 1.5 billion bushels. And that's a pretty big number. As we move to the next slide, you can really see how significant that might be in terms of where corn prices could potentially be if we had been able to reduce the current ending stocks to a much lower number. And so you can see right now, we're looking at about 2.5 billion bushels, and by reducing that to about a little over a billion bushel, we would clearly have much higher prices. one of the things that I wanted to talk about as well as we looked at ending stocks, and that really kind of goes back to the earlier discussion about price, is price is determined primarily by demand. And so this gives us a little bit of an indication in terms of where that demand is coming from, in terms of how it affects ending stocks. So in the case of corn, most of our corn is either fed to livestock, exported, or converted to ethanol. So once we subtract that total usage, we have what's referred to as ending stocks. And so as you can see, back in 2011 and 2012, we had much, much higher prices given the fact that we had tighter stocks. And of course, we're seeing some declining prices now as we look at much, much higher ending stocks. And so again, one of the big impacts as we look at ethanol consumption, that clearly has been reduced. So let's take you back to that March, April time period. When COVID began and we had some shutdowns in many areas, we had essentially a reduction of about 50% of gasoline usage. And of course, conversely, that also brought ethanol usage down about at the same pace. And so what really happened is we had about 40% of our overall ethanol plants that were either closed or significantly reducing their production. And so when you have a demand staple like ethanol that represents about 36% of your overall usage, it has a significant price impact. And so that's really been kind of weighing on the market. We've seen some improvement lately in terms of ethanol demand. And it also kind of connects back to oil prices as well. So the other disruption as we look at ending stocks has been feed that is fed to livestock, and that represents about 40% of our overall usage. And so if you can recall again, back in that April-May time period, because of COVID, we also had some meat packing plants that were either closed down totally or they were clearly reducing their output. And so then basically what happened is that, we're seeing lower consumption from livestock because of this. If you recall, we also went through a time period where we were having trouble processing livestock and many of them had to be euthanized. And so that clearly was a disruption, especially as we look at the corn market. So let's go ahead and move on to soybeans. And clearly on soybeans, the real issue was at least 2 years ago, the trade war that began with China. So you can really see what happened in the second quarter to the third quarter of 2018. We had about a $1 drop in soybean prices. And so clearly that had a really direct effect from the trade war that we had with China. The good news is that we have a phase 1 agreement in place that was approved January 15th of 2020. But it was such a significant issue because remember that 60% of our soybean exports go to China. And so it was very important that we were able to resolve some of these issues. The future is a little bit uncertain in terms of what the next steps may be. The Chinese government has stated that they are going to put things on hold. Phase 1 is in place. They will abide by these agreements. But as we move, we're going to have to wait till we move past the election before we have more direction on future trade with China. So again, you can see how much prices were impacted. We're clearly in a lower price pattern. One of the other things that happened because of the China trade war is that they shifted their demand to Brazil. So as we moved into the latter part of 2018, almost 100% of their soybeans that were exported from Brazil to China came obviously from Brazil. And so our exports really shut down to zero in terms of us doing business with China. The good news is we were able to redirect those soybeans to parts of Southeast Asia, parts of the European Union as well. So we were able to, certainly exports were reduced, but we were able to kind of shift some of that demand to, certainly some other locations. So as we move on to the next slide, as we look at overall ending stocks, and maybe I'll just make a few comments about the demand side of soybeans in terms of how we determine this ending stock number. Again, soybeans that are left over at the end of the year. But basically, soybean demand is really two primary factors. One is crush, and crush is really has two byproducts, soybean meal and soybean oil. And then the balance of the soybeans are then exported. And so, again, the ending stocks are the soybeans that are left over, again, determining price. And so a few other additional factors beyond the China tariffs that really have had an impact on soybean prices is African swine fever. And China, over the past 12 to 18 months, has lost almost half of their hog herd due to African swine fever, and that comprises well over 200 million head of hogs. And so it's really a very, very big number. And so keep in mind that we're exporting soybeans to China, converted to soybean meal, and then the soybean meal then is fed to the hog inventory in China. And so this has had certainly an effect on the overall demand of soybeans in China as well. So really, as I mentioned earlier, what we've seen is that Brazil has shifted their export activity to China. They had a record crop this past year, and within the next couple of months or so, they'll begin planting the 2020, 2021 crop. All indications are that acreage will probably increase about 5% or so. And so that may have a little bit of an impact on the market. So a lot of things going on the demand side in terms of both corn and soybeans over the past 2 years.
Great, thanks, Jim. Now is a great time for all of you watching to go ahead and send in any questions you have regarding grain markets. We are getting ready to close this session up. Jim, I'm going to ask, as you look to the future, are you seeing any bright spots?
Well, we spent a lot of time talking about overall demand, Casey, and clearly we're seeing some repair of some of this damage to demand that has occurred. We've never gone through something like COVID-19 in our history, and it's had such a huge impact in a number of different ways. As I mentioned earlier, the 2020 crop looks excellent, so we kind of have a pretty good idea that supply-wise we're in good shape. We have a little bit tighter corn acres than what we thought maybe this spring, and so that clearly should help prices a little bit. But slowly but surely, we are starting to build back demand. We have some improved trade with China, and that really has been a positive. The United States clearly has the best infrastructure in the world in terms of not only producing the crop, but getting it to the market. And so I think that bodes well for us to compete with other countries as well. We're obviously still trying to improve our overall trade with China. And some things to keep in mind there as well is that, as I mentioned earlier, hog production clearly has been hit pretty hard in China, and they've been a huge customer of ours. What is happening is they are repopulating their herds. Many of the hogs that were lost during African swine fever were more of the backyard production scenarios versus more of the confinement units. So as China is repopulating its herd, they're building more and more confinement units. And I think in the future, we will continue to see very good demand for soybeans. And there is a high likelihood that we could also see some excellent demand on the corn side as well. And so again, I think we're well positioned in terms of rebounding. Clearly, we're making some real gains in terms of export activity. Those numbers are up. Ethanol has been a little bit of a roller coaster in terms of seeing some improvement. and then kind of moving back a little bit. But overall, I think we're pretty well positioned to see some much better overall demand, especially as we move toward 2021.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jim. It looks like we did get a couple questions that came in. The first one is, so obviously prices have fluctuated. How do you incorporate the pricing into management decisions?
Well, that's a really timely question, because we have really had to do that this summer. Do you apply, some additional fungicide on a crop, to make some other management decision? And so all those decisions are really based on what kind of a return we're going to get. And so they're much easier as we look at $4 and $5 corn versus $3 corn. All of a sudden, the payback is a little bit more difficult to achieve. So we've looked at those really closely and used a bit tighter scenario in terms of what kind of a return we're gonna receive. So those numbers are clearly changing compared to where they were a few years ago.
Great. And you touched on ending stocks earlier. This person wants to know, when is ending stocks determined? Is that ongoing or a certain month of the year?
So ending stocks basically are determined on September 1 of the marketing year. And that kind of makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Because we need to know what basically the leftover inventory is going to be prior to harvest. And so with harvest starting in September, it makes sense to have that number in place then. So it's clearly much easier to measure as we get toward the end of that production cycle.
Great. Looks like we have a couple more questions. Does China produce any of its own grain?
So China, in terms of corn and soybean production, clearly on corn, they are the #2 producer of corn in the world. And so all of the corn that they produce, they use domestically. And so they previously had an initiative to convert some of that to ethanol, but they weren't able to get the ethanol plants built quickly enough. And so that initiative has kind of been pushed forward. But in the case of soybeans, they are, I believe, the 4th largest producer of soybeans in the world, but they also feed all of their soybeans. So China has not been an export competitor. They have clearly been importing all of the grain that they need, which has put the U.S. in a very good position in terms of supplying some of the overall needs.
Great. Looks like we do have one more question. I'm going to try to ask this right. So what percent of 200M hogs lost were from CAFOs?
Okay. So I'm not sure what the acronym of CAFO stands for, but basically the 200 million head of hogs that were lost to African swine fever. And so that occurred over about a 8 to 10 month time period. And so information out of China was a little bit hard to gather. Sometimes they're not always quite as transparent as they need to be, but we had a number of estimates that originally it was 20 or 25%, and now I think the more accurate assessment is in that 40 to 50%, but all of that death loss did occur from African swine fever.
Great. Well, Jim, thank you so much for talking with us today. And again, if any of you have any more questions regarding grain markets, you can contact Jim directly at contact@hertz.ag, and we'd be more than happy to help answer any questions you have regarding grain markets. I do want to remind everyone of that tech support number. Again, that number is 515-382-7971. I know we had some audio issues earlier on, so we just want to make sure that you are getting today's information and able to hear and see everything. So again, one more time, that number is 515-382-7971. We are getting ready to move into farmland leases, and here discussing that a bit more with me today is Jeff Trundle. Jeff is president of Hertz Farm Management and currently travels back and forth between our Cedar Falls office and our Nevada office. He has appraised, managed, sold, and acquired rural properties for clients since 1986. Jeff, thanks so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you for having me, Casey.
We just heard from Jim and learned a little bit about grain markets and commodity prices. So I'm going to flip the question a little bit on you. And how have grain markets impacted leases?
Yeah. Well, certainly grain prices are an important part of any lease that you'd have. And if you have the custom or a modified crop share lease, they're kind of self-correcting, so that if you have higher grain prices, you're going to have more revenue. If you have lower grain prices, you're going to have lower revenue. But with cash rent, we get one time a year to set that typically, unless you're on some kind of a flex lease. But on the traditional cash rent lease, you're going to be determining what you're going to get for revenue probably about this time of the year normally. And so you're having to try to determine what I'm willing to accept for the next year on my farm. But prices aren't the only factor that you need to consider. There are other factors that enter in. Yield, of course, is one of those, because that's the other component of revenue. And you want to make sure that you're looking at what that yield goal is going to be. Also, where's your farm located? Do you have a farm near a river terminal or an ethanol plant where you can get a little higher price for your crop? And then, do you have livestock in the area? There may be, you may not be close to one of those terminals, but you may have a heavy livestock usage for feed, and so a lot of the grain elevators will pay you a little bit more for your product. The quality of your farm also enters in, because as we all know, seed, fertilizer, and chemicals cost quite a little bit to put a crop in, and it costs the same to put it in on an acre that's going to produce 180 bushel corn versus a piece of land that might produce 200 plus bushel corn. So that factors in to how you set your cash rent. And then there are some areas that have specialty crops like seed corn or seed soybeans, where you can get a little premium for that product, and that will keep rents a little higher in those areas. Government payments will factor in as well, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through the day.
Great. And, you know, with COVID and stuff, everyone's starting to get antsy and look towards the future. So is now the time to negotiate next year's lease? Well,
the short answer on that, Casey, is probably no. We don't think so. And the reason being is that this is a year where we've just got a lot of unknowns. COVID has certainly added to the list, but there are other things that we typically have a little better handle on than we are going to have this year. One of those is yield. Looks like we're lining up for a great crop in most of the Midwest, but if you're on the west side of I-35 in Iowa, you're not feeling very good about your crop. It's they're having some really dry conditions, and may look at one of the smaller crops they've had since 2012. So that's an unknown. So we're going to recommend to most people that you're going to wait until after harvest just to know what that yield factor is. Another reason to wait until later is government program payments. We've gotten a CFAP payment, which is the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program payment, and that varied by farm. A lot of times when the government sends payments out, we can make a kind of a blanket statement. Well, if you're in this county, you're going to get this many dollars. Well, this particular program was set up so that it's variable by operator, and it gives you the lesser of half of your production from 2019 times a certain amount, or the inventory that you had on hand on January 15th, 2020. Well, if you were an aggressive marketer and you had all your grain marketed before January 15th, you might not get any payments. If you had not marketed anything, you're going to get a payment on half of your crop. And so it makes a big difference. Those payments are going to range anywhere from $0 to $40, $45 per acre. So that's a factor that needs to be considered. We also have another government program, either ARC, which is the Agriculture Risk Coverage, or PLC, which is Price Loss Coverage. And those payments are going to come out here in October. They're actually for the 2019 crop, but they're going to be paid in 2020, so they kind of need to factor in to how you determine rents this year, because we didn't take them into account last year because we had no idea what those were going to be at the time. So those are other government program payments, and it does happen to be an election year, Casey, so there is a chance that there might be another payment announced yet, especially with the ongoing COVID situation. So those things have to be taken into account. One other factor that you wouldn't think would enter in on a year where you've got high yields is your crop revenue coverage. And so even though we're going to have some good yields because prices have fallen from the spring price on crop insurance, we may still see some small payments for revenue losses. So this year, corn prices in the spring were $3.88 for crop insurance and $9.17 on beans. And so if we have prices that are below that times the yield, we may still be below what the guarantee was for this year. And that depends a lot on what level of coverage you or your operator took. So most people take between 75 and 85% of a normal crop. And so that will factor in as well. So those are lots of different things that we have to consider this year as we're trying to determine what's a fair rent.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. Now is a great time for all of you watching to go ahead and send in any questions you have regarding leases. We are getting ready to wrap this session up. So Jeff, I'm going to ask you to look into your crystal ball, and what does this mean for next year? Where do you see leases going?
Yeah, this was a terrible week to take my crystal ball in for repairs, but even with that, it's a tough question to answer. I did bring a slide here with some information about historical rents. Sometimes you can get some information by looking at the past, and as you can see on the chart here, we've got rents from four different states: Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, and Nebraska. And all of those states had a rise in rents in 2011 through about 15, and then things started to fall off. And the last 3 years, we've been fairly stable. And I think we would have seen that again this year and maybe even had an opportunity for a little increase in rents, but with the COVID thing going on, some other factors playing in, now it looks like chances are more of a steady to slightly lower bias at this time. Right now, if you're talking with your operator, they're laser focused on the price of corn and beans, especially corn, because that's down about 20% from where it was a year ago. But until we have these final yields, you know, it's total revenue that you need to look at. We don't know if we're going to be down 20% on income or if we're going to be down 10%, because if yields are up 10%, even with a lower price, we wouldn't lower income by the amount that the prices are down. So based on what we know today, there's still some things out there that we'd like to have a little better handle on before we determine what rents are going to be for next year. But today our bias would be probably steady to slightly lower. If you're trying to check yourself as to whether your particular rent is in line, historically rents have been 30 to 40% of whatever the revenue is for that year. And so if, for example, you know revenue is going to be $700 for this year, take that times 30%. If you're a lower quality farm, that'd be a rent of around $210. If you take it times 40%, it'd be a rent around $280. Now, certainly there are other factors, but it just gives you a kind of an idea of where to start looking to see whether you're in line. And also a good thing to remember is that rents are a year behind. When everybody understands that we base next year's rent on what's happening this year, things work out pretty good, because most of the information that you need to make a decision are known. But if one of the parties, either the owner or the operator, start trying to project what things might be next year, that's where we run into some problems, because now we've got some disengagement there. And that's where you kind of get your arguments, because one's looking at one set of parameters, another one's looking at maybe the facts from this year. So one way around that being a year behind is a flex lease. And in that situation, you take a little lower rent as a base, and then you have some kind of factor that usually involves yield and price to determine what the final rent will be. And that way you get what you deserve every year based on what actually happens. Of course, if you want to do that, in the past, we've always done it with a custom or modified crop share lease, where you get a share of the crop, and therefore you're going to get exactly what you deserve every year in that particular year. With the traditional cash rent, you're just a year behind typically. I do have a slide here with the termination dates for leases in the different states. And it's important to remember that if you want to make a change, you need to notify your tenant prior to these dates and do that formally, usually with a letter that's certified. There are other ways to do it. You can have them acknowledge it voluntarily if you're going to be able to meet with them before that date, but most people will send that by certified letter. Now, you may have some operators that send a notice this year because they're nervous about what we're going to end up with, and they don't know what government payments may still be in store for us prior to the election. They don't know what our yields are going to be, so they may send you a notice. If that happens, I just recommend that you say, hey, we'll talk to you before we talk to anybody else, but we want to wait until after harvest so we have as much information as possible to make the right decision. If you have an operator that's just too nervous to give you what you think you deserve for rent, but you really want to keep that operator, maybe you want to terminate the lease and then go to a modified crop share or a custom where you can continue to work with that operator, but you're now going to share some of that risk with him or her, and then that'll allow you to continue to work with the person you're most comfortable with. So.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. It looks like we did get a couple questions that have come in.
Okay.
So as a general rule, do you feel 2021 cash rents in Nebraska will remain steady, increase, or decrease from 2020?
Yeah, well, we just kind of went through that, and it's really hard to know at this point. I'm pretty confident they won't be going up. But until we have a little bit more information, it's hard to know whether they'll stay steady or go down. A lot of operators will probably leave the lease in place if they, have decent yield coming because they're not going to want to risk losing a farm. But if they are uncomfortable, we just suggest that you both take a pause, wait until harvest, and then try to come up with a fair rent.
Great. And are there farmers looking for more land to rent, or is it best to stay with current renters?
There are always people looking to add acres, especially as machinery has gotten bigger. People can handle more acres with the same labor, and so there's always somebody looking for another farm to add. But there's a lot to be said about loyalty, and if you're loyal to your operator, you're probably going to end up with a better long-term return than if you're constantly switching operators, even though you could do that. The things that start to slip when you don't give that operator confidence that he's coming back is how much fertilizer is he willing to put on your farm if he's concerned that he might not have it the next year? Or is he willing to put lime on when it should be? Is he willing to maintain your waterways the way you want it maintained? So I think unless that operator is doing some things that just don't line up with the way you want your farm treated, I think it's usually better to stick with the operator you have.
Great. Looks like we have time for a couple more questions. So how much weight should yield have on lease negotiations?
Well, yield's a really important factor because it's one of the two factors that make crop revenue. And so I think in a normal year, when you can expect that we're going to have an average crop, you don't factor it in quite as much as we're going to factor it in this year because prices have fallen so much. So this year, I think it's really critical to know that information before you make the decision on what you should do for next year's yield.
Great. And despite current and future economic uncertainty, still best to do cash leases 1 year at a time?
Well, yeah, uncertainty is certainly rampant right now, but even when things are normal, we recommend a 1 year lease for a number of reasons. Number one, things change without people being aware that things are going to come up. This year's a great example of that. And so had you just tied into a 3-year lease, you may have put an operator in a position that he can't deal with. Now you've made that person a bad guy when they come back and try to change things. It happened the other way back in the 2012-13 range, where people had just tied into a 3-year or a 5-year lease, and then rents went up $50 or $100 an acre for a couple of years, and people had no recourse. They had already tied into their rent. So doing a 1 year lease makes a lot of sense for both parties. It's a lot of work to do it every year. But again, if you don't like that, there are other lease types that will self-adjust for you so that you don't have to have that battle with your operator if that's what it's turning into for you.
Great. Well, Jeff, thank you so much for coming in and talking with us today. And if any of you have any more questions for Jeff regarding leases, you can contact him directly at contact@hertz.ag, and he will help answer any questions you have regarding leases.
Thanks, Casey.
Next up, we do have a short break scheduled, so now's a great time to go refill your coffee cups, and we will get started back up here shortly. Welcome back, everyone. We are going to keep right on moving into farmland values, and here discussing that with me today is Doug Hensley. Doug is president of Hertz Real Estate Services and works out of our Nevada, Iowa office. Doug started with Hertz in June of 2017 and moved to Nevada from Illinois, where he had been involved in his own real estate business before joining Hertz. Doug, thanks for joining me today.
It's great to be with you, Casey, and all of you that are in your home or office.
Great. So a lot has happened over the last few months. So let's talk about, in regards to farmland values, what's happened over the last 6 months that has impacted land values?
Yeah, great question. And it's a question that we spend a lot of time talking about, obviously, given the circumstances here in 2020. So I'll back up and let's go to the beginning of the year, because I think that's relevant for setting the stage with what's happened over the past 6 months or so. We came into 2020 as Jeff and Jim have both, I think, spent a little time talking to you about today. We came into 2020 with some amount of momentum, actually, in the farmland market, largely built on the confidence of having a new NAFTA agreement, USMCA, the Canada-Mexico agreement. That was a big accomplishment for our country and supportive to our commodity markets. Likewise, with the phase 1 agreement with China, that was a very significant milestone that was putting some positive energy into both our commodity markets and our farmland markets earlier this year. And in the first 10 weeks or so of the year, so from January through mid-March, we had, I felt like, a really stable sales environment, and the sales that we were handling and were observing in the marketplace across the Midwest were quite stable. Then COVID hit, and obviously that brought the shutdowns and the stay-at-home orders, and temporarily at least, COVID changed our farmland market and in a couple of different ways. Not only were group gatherings restricted, but some individuals in the marketplace, frankly, were fearful. And whenever you have fear enter the market, it just changes the nature of the marketplace. And so with that fear and just the lockdowns, public auctions were postponed and or canceled. Fortunately, we only had one auction that was postponed over in north central Illinois as a result of the lockdown orders. And in the farmland business, we always deal, Casey, with some level of uncertainty, whether it's what commodity prices are going to be doing or where our yields are going to be. But in circumstances like March and April, we just dealt with a multiple of uncertainty that we had never really handled before or ever had in our marketplace. And in a situation like that, one of the worst things that a seller can do as it relates to farmland values and selling a farm into a period of great uncertainty is to force it. And you never want to force something when both sellers and buyers are both uncertain. And so what we spent a lot of time doing was shepherding our clients, making very specific case-by-case decisions as to what was going to be in the best interest of the clients that we were working for. And so all of the activities that we did this spring and over the past 6 months, we've done very, very carefully. Fortunately, March, April, May, the kind of the out of the gate months for COVID, as it related to farmland sales, occurred during the time of year when we have probably from a sales volume perspective is the lowest sales volume time of year that we have in the farmland market. And that stands to reason because in March, April, and May, that's when we're planting our corn, soy, and soybean crops. We're focused on other things versus being very solely focused on what's happening in the land market. And not that COVID happened at a good time, because having a global pandemic is obviously nothing that you ever want to have happen. But if the farmland market could have chosen when something like that was going to happen, this period in March, April, and May, the onset of that was something that couldn't have happened at a better time if we could have chosen it. Said a different way, had COVID, the onset of that happened, Casey, in July, August, September, it could have been significantly more disruptive to our farmland market. And what we have seen over the past 4 to 6 months is that, by and large, the farmland market has kept its head about it. It's probably the best way that I can describe it. And there have been a couple of major implications from what has happened over the past 4 to 6 months. One of the implications deals with sales volume. And I'm going to show you a chart here that shows sales volume. This is in the state of Iowa, so it's not directly applicable in terms of exact sales in the state of Nebraska. But the same thing happened in Nebraska is what I'm reflecting on this chart here. And that is sales volume in the entire marketplace cratered. And again, it goes back to that uncertainty metric that we talked about. When people are fearful and or uncertain, they have a tendency to make no major decisions. And that's essentially what we saw this year, is that when given the option to make big decisions, people just held off on doing so. And so sales volumes were down in the first 4 to 6 months of the year. For the few farms that have sold, it's actually been very supportive to price, and that goes back to kind of the supply and demand curve. When you have a very low supply of inventory and available farms for sale, there are still people that are interested in expanding their operation or adding on to their investment portfolio. And when you have a low supply and still some amount of demand after people kind of got their feet under them with the environment of COVID, because there's been few farms for sale, we've seen, again, a very supportive price situation in the marketplace. Second major implication that we have seen as a result of COVID over the past 4 to 6 months is that sales methods have adjusted. Typically in our marketplace, we're a heavy traditional brokered listings. We're heavy on public auctions, and occasionally we'll have one of these hybrid type of sales, whether it's a sealed bid sale or some other type of hybrid sale. In the case when COVID hit, there weren't public auctions going on simply because of the limitations with having group gatherings. So traditional listings for the few farms that did sell, we continued to see and handle traditional listings. We also saw an increase in the number and the acceptance of online auctions. And that is something that over the years we've seen eBay and some of the other online marketplaces become more prevalent with personal property. But as it relates to real property and specifically farmland, we have not seen as wide of acceptance of online auctions and just the different variations of the way online auctions can be rolled out. But that is something that the market has actually started to attend to and find more acceptable. So we're seeing that people have made an adjustment there. And then the third major implication as it relates to the real estate industry just has to do with, you know, at the time that the COVID hit our society and our marketplace, and this isn't necessarily specific to farmland, but it includes farmland, we saw a tremendous number of deals blow up in the marketplace. So if you think about in the residential business or in the commercial real estate sector or in farmland, when people are losing their jobs or they have lost their financing that they thought they had, or frankly, in these situations where because of the great uncertainty and fear that existed, when people just get cold feet, there are deals, a lot of deals in the real estate business that went sideways. Fortunately, and I'm really proud of all of our staff across Hertz Farm Management and Real Estate Services, that we did not have a single deal that went sideways as a result of COVID. And I think part of that comes back to the approach to shepherding transactions from start to finish, and really understanding the objectives and being able to walk with families and individuals through their buying and selling decisions. So that is something that I think is a real thing that happened in the industry. Now, as we got into the growing season and June approached and we started to see some of the limitations in all of our state marketplaces, whether in Nebraska or Iowa or Minnesota or wherever it was, we started to see signs of activity again because the limitations that were placed by the governing authorities began to lift in many cases, and the market began to function more completely. And I think people were able to make risk assessments and make a little more informed decisions as to how they wanted to handle things. And you should know, all of you out there, that we have handled a surprising amount of volume of sales, particularly in the month of June and July. And is it a normal market? Not necessarily normal, but I would say it is a fully functioning market. And I think what we're able to do, as much as we ever have, is in every case of a farm situation that we're working with owners on and trying to put together a process for them to sell it, we've always given very specific recommendations on your farm and how we should handle that specific sale. And we tailor our recommendations very dependent upon your objectives as an owner, as well as what's going on in that local market. I really feel like that tailoring recommendations has been something that has been really, really important for us to do this year, even more so than it always has been. And so I think the experience factor from a real estate business perspective has come into play this year in a way that maybe it hasn't in the past, where inexperienced agents in the past have been able to move deals through. Today, you need an experienced broker or auction company to work with you, because you never know what the uncertainty is going to be, as we obviously experienced this spring. Great.
Well, you've fast forward to where we need to be. So you've touched a little bit on the past. Let's talk about what is happening in the market today.
Yeah, so kind of like what I mentioned here a little bit ago, once we got into June and July, the market, I really felt like, started to more fully function again. And I think that has been something that's been an encouragement to people who were considering a sale, because earlier in the year, when we had people who may have been thinking about selling, they postponed their decision, or, you know, in some cases said, I'm just gonna wait, and we'll wait until fall. Well, we're starting to see that market come alive again. Having said that, it's fair to say that we're still not in the heart of our selling season. And most farms, in terms of a majority of farms that do sell in a year, sell between the 1st of September to mid to late March. It's basically that off season when you don't have the issue with growing crops, and you also have maybe reached the end of a lease. So those two things play into it. And I think as we get into the selling season, we're going to come to some additional conclusions about exactly where the market's at. But again, what we do know based on those farms that have sold, I feel like we're in a very stable market going into fall. And here in the state of Nebraska, I'm going to show you a chart here that shows, for the first time actually in several years, we have some strength in the Nebraska market that hasn't really existed, at least across the board. coming, over the last 10 years, we saw a huge ramp up in Nebraska land values. And because of that huge ramp up, probably from a percentage perspective compared to other states, Nebraska had a much larger run up in values. And then when 2014 and 2015 happened with lower grain prices, Nebraska has had several consecutive years in a row of lower land values, and it's kind of been a longer glide path lower than what several other states have had. Not to mention with the real estate tax situation in Nebraska, that has caused some additional negativity that other states haven't had to deal with. But this year, again, for the first time in a number of years, we're starting to see, I feel like we've kind of maybe scraped the bottom on Nebraska land values, and we're starting to see some positivity. We don't yet know how the land market's going to respond, obviously, here in the fall of 2020. But coming into the year, I think Nebraska had as firm a footing as they could have had in a number of years.
Great. Now is a great time for all of you watching to go ahead and send in any questions you have regarding farmland values. We are getting ready to wrap this session up. Doug, what should people expect this fall?
Yeah, great question. Always $1 million question. What's going to happen in the future? And I think Jeff said that he had his crystal ball in for work this week, and I won't necessarily go there. I'll give you a little bit more than that, but a couple of things that I think you can expect this fall. I do think that we're going to see an increasing volume of sales, and part of that has to do with the fact that some of those sales, as I mentioned earlier, that were postponed earlier in the year are going to be brought to the market ultimately, because people have, again, they've been able to kind of get their footing with the risk assessment as to how things are, and the sales that have happened have actually been encouraging of moving to market if you were ever thinking about that. Likewise, given that we're going into the busiest time of year from a sales perspective, we're going to see an uptick in the number of sales, so that's going to play into it. Where you're at in the marketplace and how positive a sale might go or might not go will depend on a lot of things that happen locally. I think Nebraska is setting up to have a really nice crop this year compared to recent years. And this is something that I want to show you, the crop conditions report. Some of you out there may pay attention to this, but this is something that I pay pretty close attention to in any given year. And if you look at the state of Nebraska, both corn and soybean ratings, from a good and excellent standpoint, 77% of the corn crop is rated good or excellent, and 79% of the soybean crop is rated good or excellent. It surpasses the performance of the U.S. As a total marketplace, but also I think we're positioning the market for as good of a crop in the state of Nebraska as we've had in a number of years. And so I think even though grain prices aren't necessarily where we want them to be, the fact that we're going to have a lot of bushels to sell is going to keep people in the marketplace if there's a nice farm that becomes available. So from a stability perspective, I think all the things are positioning for a stable market. We have low interest rates. We're going to have a really good crop. And if people were able to take advantage of some of the early 2020 grain market rally, and then we had a little rally here in the month of July, I think people will be able to take advantage of a better position and to be in a better position financially than maybe what they envisioned when we were scraping the bottom on the commodity markets here over the past 4 months.
Great. Well, it looks like we do have a couple questions that came in here. So is this a good time to buy given the down markets and price drops?
Yeah, so that's a question that we're kind of talking about on both sides of it. Is it a good time to buy? Is it a good time to sell? And I think it depends upon your objectives and whether you are tied to a particular area, because I think from a buyer's perspective, probably the thing that you're going to want to look closest at is the areas that actually have a weak crop. Because whenever you have an area that has a growing season struggle and isn't going to have good crops, a lot of those local participants in the marketplace may not be as bullish or as aggressive in bidding for a farm that may come available. On the flip side, if you're an investor and you're not necessarily concerned about where you buy a farm, you're looking for value, that's when you will want to enter the marketplace, is when the aggressiveness of other possible market participants isn't as great. And so it can be a good time, but it very much matters on the local conditions as to where the farm is and exactly what you're looking at. So it depends, and it depends on local conditions in a lot of cases.
Great. So what do you think the effect in Nebraska farm values would be if the step up in basis at death is eliminated?
Yeah, that's a big question. Anytime tax policy comes out, boy, it can be painful for one group or another. And the step up in basis is a really positive result for anyone who is inheriting a farm. And if you don't have that step up in basis, where you will then have significant capital gains to pay on, if you would move to sell a farm, that's going to impact behavior in a pretty significant way, Casey. And so I think we would probably see at least a period of time where we may not see as many sales that occur after that loss of a step up in basis. If that were to happen, I think we would see a slug of sales before the tax policy law came into being. And then if we were to lose a step up in basis, I think we would see a drop off in the number of sales simply because people don't want to pay capital gains, don't want to pay any more taxes to the government than they have to. So I think there would maybe be a little bit of a dual impact of that. There would be a number of sales that would happen before tax policy formally came into being, and then once it did come into being, I think we would see a drop in sales volume. Great.
And then in regards to NAFTA, how did the new trade agreement help our grain market, and in what way?
Yeah, great question, whoever sent that in. NAFTA was a big deal to our grain markets. Mexico is actually our #1 customer when it comes to corn, and so the strength in the commodity markets is all about having end users and building demand. And whenever we have a significant trading partner who gets into a position where we are easier to do business with than what we were before, or it takes away some of the potential for conflict, boy, that sets us up to sell a lot more grain to those trading partners. And again, Mexico and Canada are both very significant trading partners to us. And whenever we can make that road to trade agricultural products is a big deal to us. That's obviously supportive to build demand, which when we have building demand, typically that's going to be price positive to the commodities that we're growing. So whenever we are price positive, that's going to ultimately trickle down to increase profitability at the farm level. And whenever we can increase profitability at the farm level, that will make the buying audience larger and will position people to be more profitable and compete more effectively for additional farms.
Great. It looks like we've got time for one more question. Okay. Does Hertz offer online auctions, and what do those look like?
That's a great question. As I mentioned, that has been one of the big impacts or implications of the COVID situation was people have adjusted, and they've adjusted to sale methods and thinking about things in maybe a way that they wouldn't have previously. And Hertz has adjusted as well. We have had an online auction platform for quite some time, and we have become more active in employing that. We have an app that you can download for either your iPhone or your Android, or through the internet, through our website. We also have the ability to deliver online auction services through our website. Now, for a number of months, actually a year or two now, we've been streaming our auctions online through Facebook Live. If we get to the point again where we are unable to have group gatherings, we're not going to miss a beat. We're going to be able to just roll into an online only auction platform. And it's going to be different than eBay, where you have a timed auction and nobody's really guiding you through that. It's really important to us to do business very personally with both the buyers and sellers that we are working with and for. And so our vision and the way that we employ online auction services is we're going to simulcast an auctioneer that's actually going to be guiding a sale through the internet or through the phone app versus gathering at a VFW or a community hall at 10 o'clock on Thursday morning. We're still going to conduct the sale at 10 o'clock on Thursday morning, but instead of gathering in person when we have an online auction, you will be gathering together through the technology that's available, and the auctioneer is going to guide you through that sale process, very similar to how it has occurred in the past in person. So be watching for that this fall. We'll make it very clear as to whether a sale is going to be online only or whether we will have simulcast from an actual physical auction site. So that's something to be watching for. But Casey, we certainly have that ability, and that's something that is going to be a new thing for, I'm sure, many of you this fall as you're seeing auctions that are more limited to be in person. You're going to see that a bunch more.
Well, Doug, thanks so much for coming in and talking with us today.
Good to be with all of you. Thank you for the questions.
Yeah. And if you have any questions for Doug regarding farmland values, you can contact him directly at contact@hertz.ag, and he'd be more than happy to help answer any questions you have regarding farmland values. I do want to talk about that chat box feature here for just a second. I think I forgot to mention at the beginning that we are recording that feature. I know there were a couple questions that we were not able to get to during that last session. So don't be discouraged. Keep sending those questions in, and we will have someone answer those shortly after today's webinar. We've touched on this next subject quite a bit today, but diving into more specifics on COVID-19 and the impact it's had on agriculture is Randy Hertz. Randy is CEO of Hertz Farm Management and works out of our Nevada, Iowa office. Randy has over 40 years of experience as a farmland professional in farmland brokerage, farm management, and valuation. Randy, thanks for joining me today.
Good morning.
We are going to go ahead and dive right into our first question. So what has the impact of COVID-19 been on farming and farmland ownership?
Yes, thank you for joining us today. We appreciate you being here, and we hope you are enjoying the presentations by our team members. But COVID has been terribly disruptive to business, personal lives, and lots of things. In terms of farming and agriculture, there's really two stories. One story is of the livestock side. They've been more disrupted with the supply chain, primarily because the packing plants, the employees have gotten infected by coronavirus and gotten COVID-19, and they've slowed down, they've shut them down, cleaned them up, and fortunately they're pretty much back in balance, but they're still backed up. One of our local locker plants, one of our clients tried to get a beef dated in for next year, and the earliest they could get it in was October of 2021. So that's how disruptive that has been. On the other side, the crop farms have been less disrupted. We've got a good supply of seed. We've got a good supply of crop protection products and fertilizer. We had good weather generally this spring, and so the crop got planted on time, and we've got a great crop coming in most areas. There's a couple places that could use a good drink of water, but fortunately a lot of areas are looking greener than they've looked in years, and we'll have an abundant crop. As Doug mentioned, cropland prices have been stable. There's been some opportunities for some purchase of lower price farms, but for quality farmland, those prices have been fairly firm. We went through a period of time where there was less activity. People were frozen down, unable to decide should they sell, should they buy, and so we saw the volume go down, but certainly that's been picking up lately as things have opened up.
Great. So with everything happening, what kind of changes have you seen both in the ag world and the business world?
Sure. And in March, our firm pivoted to socially distanced, to physically distanced. We eliminated unnecessary travel. We had a time that people would quarantine if they did have to travel and were in a large group. We encouraged face coverings, and I believe that this has caused us to be fairly safe for our clients, for our employees, for our farm operators. Luckily in farming, you can physically distance, particularly in crop farming, and be fairly safe. Certainly communications has changed. And you can, how many are Zooming? This video conference, our webinar that we're doing today, we pivoted that. Typically we have a dozen landowner seminars scattered around the Midwest, and now we're coming live to you in your, wherever you are, your living room, your dining room, your office, wherever. And we have built that skill. It's not just Zoom. We use Teams and FaceTime, Google Hangouts. There's a number of different platforms, and what we weren't very good at before, we're much better at today. And that communications has changed. We can be physically separated, but I can talk to my sister in California, and we can be emotionally closer without being physically close. And that's allowed us to communicate. We hope that you're communicating with your farmland professionals and getting the information that you need. And we're just give them a call if you've got questions or so on. But COVID has certainly concentrated and concerned people to be safe. And that's changed how we do business. It's changed what businesses are open, what businesses are closed. And it's changed a lot of things.
Great. Well, it's certainly been disruptive to a lot of things that we are normally used to. Now is a great time for all of you watching to go ahead and send in any questions you have regarding COVID-19 and agriculture. We are getting ready to wrap this session up. So Randy, I'm going to end with, what will the long-term impact of COVID-19 on the farm economy be?
Oh, that's a good question. We're fortunate that you can physically distance, and it's certainly changed a lot of things. One of the positive changes has been technology. Certainly we've seen a lot of technological change in farming in terms of being more precise, in being able to get the right amount of fertilizer where you want it, to be able to understand how to improve the productivity of each of your fields with drainage, with our drone fleet that we've got. That technology has been really important through COVID and the impacts of that. We continually improve each year the seed that we use, the crop protection products. We've got some problems and opportunities for solution because we've got weeds that are resistant to things. But again, it's important to use that technology. Communications has impacted agriculture, but we have a sort of a two-sided. We've got the haves and the have-nots. The haves are those businesses that can remain socially distanced or physically distanced, can work from home, have been able to pivot and can stay in business and provide valuable service. We've got a whole nother side of the service industries that have had to close down. If you were one of those service people in a restaurant, and yes, you can have carryout now, but it's not the same. If you're in the entertainment business, that's just totally closed that down. Heaven forbid you're in the cruise ship business, because they're out of business until there's a cure or a vaccine or something else for this. But in terms of agriculture, we're very fortunate. We've seen a little disruption in the livestock because we've moved from restaurant food to at-home food. But looking at the statistics, there's 3.5 billion more beef sales through grocery stores than there've ever been before. So that's moved from institutional and that side of the beef supply chain to through grocery stores. Certainly you need to be careful in terms of keeping your health, but in agriculture, we've seen less disruption. One thing that we've noticed with the low interest rates, we've seen some of our clients move some of their bond portfolio, which we've got record low interest rates, into farmland, because farmland provides a slightly higher coupon rate or cap rate of return, and it provides inflation protection. We've seen with the huge budget deficits, a number of people concerned about the potential for inflation going forward. And so what farmland does, it gives you that stability of a bond. At the same time, you've got the productivity increase with yields continuing to increase, with labor content going down for grain production. And that's something that you may want to consider to be safe. In most of the Midwest, it's a high proportion of the land is owned free and clear. I think it's 82% of the land in Iowa is free and clear without any debt on it. And that provides a safe harbor for store of a lot of value.
Great. Well, it looks like we do have a couple questions that came in. I read some articles about another COVID payment for farmers. Do you know if that will happen?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm not a good forecaster of what the government decides to do, but the COVID payments, which would be the CFAP, and prior to that with the Chinese market disruption with the market facilitation payments, those have been huge, and they are predicting that we'll have another COVID-related payment to agriculture. And this doesn't really get us back to where we were 5 years ago in terms of profitability, but this certainly increases us back to more normal profitability and has been huge. Some people with cash rent say, well, I'm not able to receive those payments, but your farm operator is, and that will help maintain that cash rent. And if you'd like to receive those payments, you can always custom operate or have a participating lease and qualify for those payments.
Great. And you touched on drone technology a little bit earlier, but will drone technology affect farming uses soon, and how will Hertz use that?
Oh, that's a great question. Currently, we have over 30 commercial drone pilots, and the reason we have those in-house, and it's our farmland professionals who are those pilots, is that if we use a drone for business, in other words, to look at your farm or to take pictures, we have to have a commercial UAV or drone license. And the graphics, the pictures, the video that we can get from those drones is absolutely stunning. We use it extensively in every listing or nearly every listing of farmland that we have. And our farmland professionals, they're not able to go out and take a video every week of your farm, but let's say you've got a windstorm. We had some green snap here in Iowa and in eastern Nebraska. We had some green snap and a hailstorm that came through. If you ever tried to walk through a cornfield in July or early August with 90-degree temperatures and 90% humidity, and the corn is laying helter-skelter, a drone is a great way to ground truth much more accurately. You can document how much damage there was. It's pretty incredible how useful those have been. And so all of our offices have access to that drone technology, and it's been an important technological development.
Great. Looks like we've got one more question. Are there any bright spots in all of this?
Oh, that's a good question. Certainly, we touched on a couple things. The technology that we've developed, both in terms of farming technology and the ability to monitor your field remotely with drones, and also the communication technology, being able to communicate with people virtually and with video. This Zoom webinar, we appreciate being able to do that, and the quality of the picture and the ability to access that on the internet. A challenge, though, is to get the broadband internet out to the rural areas so that everybody can have access to that very same technology. And coming back, a bright spot, I think that the stability of farmland is here. And if you look at long-term, 100 years, 70 years, farmland has continued to hold its value and to be one of the safest investments that you can have. And so I think that's a real bright spot.
Well, great, Randy. Thanks so much for joining us today. If you have any questions for Randy regarding COVID-19 and agriculture, you can contact him directly at contact@hertz.ag, and he'd be more than happy to help answer any questions you have regarding COVID-19 and agriculture. We have come to the conclusion of our webinar today, and I want to thank all of you again for joining us. Just one more quick reminder to be on the lookout for that email that you'll be receiving in the next couple days. That includes today's slides, a recording of today's webinar, and the ability for you to get in touch with a farmland professional in your area. So thank you all again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.